Good morning.
Oh,
Here we are. This is MC Starman, and we're doing our video, our weekly video on the Undiscovered Self, one of Jung's most important essays that he wrote at the end of his life. We welcome you. We're really happy that you're joining us. My friend Luke is here. How you doing, Luke?
pretty good, Martin.
Cool. We've been steady with
week.
this. Go ahead.
Said it was quite the week.
Quite the week it was. I did a post on a video on this grand cross that we're going through, and wow, something else. But that's our astrology, and I encourage people to go to our astrology videos. MC Starman playlist is current astrology, but this is Jungian psychology and the Undiscovered Self. And today we're doing the third chapter. I hit the landmark. I'm up to 310 subscribers on my channel. It doesn't sound much, but it's growing. And so we encourage you, please, to press the button at the end of the video that allows you to subscribe to the channel. You press notification too, and you'll be notified anytime a new video comes up. And then now we're doing our third chapter. And how's your channel doing? Have you seen any growth in yours?
No, I only have six subscribers. So maybe I'll ask you to put the actual link to my site below in the description.
I haven't figured out how to do. I haven't figured out how to put links, but I will. What I've been doing is I've been putting it as a tag. I've been tagging your field, the link, and so we'll continue to do that, and people will find you. And then yes, I will put it in the comment section.
Yeah, you just copy the URL and paste it below or whatever.
Yeah, but actually,
I do it with your website and your channel too every time. So just in case.
Yes. So, so this chapter that we're reading today, it's a little bit more difficult to see how relevant it is to our time, because the essay itself is very much about, it's a historical setting. You know, we have to understand that this essay is written in 1958, 1957, 1958, and you know, Jung is in Europe at the time, and the tension after World War II, and the growing of communism, and the commitment to the Iron Curtain, and the tension in Europe is really palpable. And in a sense, it's kind of like the collective tension that we're experiencing today, but it's different. And I think that to make the correlation between the historical context and understand the history of it all, and towards the end of the chapter, then it gets really poignant, and Jung ends the chapter with some information that's really poignant to us. So so I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction like that. You want to start?
Sure, I can do this first one here.
So this is chapter 3, the position of the West on the question of religion.
Confronting this development in the 20th century of our Christian era, the Western world stands with its heritage of Roman law, the treasures of Judeo-Christian ethics grounded on metaphysics, and its ideal of the inalienable rights of man. Anxiously, it asks itself the question, how can this development be brought to a standstill or put into reverse? It is useless to pillory the socialist dictatorship as utopian and to condemn its economic principles as unreasonable, because, in the first place, the criticizing West has only itself to talk to, its arguments being heard only on this side of the Iron Curtain. And, in the second place, any economic principles you like can be put into practice so long as you are prepared to accept the sacrifices they entail. You can carry through any social and economic reforms you please if, like Stalin, you let 3 million peasants starve to death and have a few million unpaid laborers at your disposal. The state of this kind has no social or economic crisis to fear. so long as its power is intact. It is to say, so long as there is a well-disciplined and well-fed police army in the offing, it can maintain its existence for an indefinitely long period and can go on increasing its power to an indefinite extent. Thanks to its excess birth rate, it can multiply the number of its unpaid workers almost at will in order to compete with its rivals, regardless of the world market, which is, to a large measure, dependent on wages. A real danger can come to it only from outside, through the threat of military attack, but this risk grows every year. Firstly, because the war potential of the dictator states is steadily increasing, and secondly, because the West cannot afford to arouse latent Russian or Chinese nationalism and chauvinism by an attack which would have exactly the opposite effect to the one intended.
So he's really breaking down the tension that occurred at that time. So far as one can see, only one possibility remains, and that is a breakdown of power from within, which must, however, be left to follow its own inner development. And I'm just going to make a quick comment here. This is prophetic. The only way, Jung says here, that the only way that the communist system is going to come to an end, it's by its own breakdown of the power within, like we've seen in the late 80s of the breakdown of communism in Russia. It wasn't something that the West did. It was something that was internal. And so the only way that such power struggles can end is internally.
Can I make a quick comment as well?
Sure.
It's actually the same thing in the West. They couldn't take the West over from outside. They had to do it from within as well. But what's funny here is I feel like if you take the state and put the individual there, it's like you can't change the individual from without either. It can only come from within, right?
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Any support from outside at present would have little effect in view of the existing security measures and the danger of nationalistic reactions. The absolute state as an army of fanatical missionaries to do its bidding in matters of foreign policy. And these, in their turn, can count on the fifth column, who are guaranteed asylum under the laws and constitutions of the Western state. So the fifth column he talks about in terms of the absolute state is that during the rise of the tension with the Iron Curtain, the penetration of the socialistic communistic agenda penetrated into the universities, and he talks about that, there was actually a infiltration of the philosophical, spiritual concepts of socialism, Marxism, and communism. So that in that sense, the Western states themselves had to deal with this social movement and political movement in there. And so that's what Jung talks about, the fifth column.
Yeah.
In addition, the communes of believers, very strong in places, considerably weaken Western government's power of decision. Whereas the West has no opportunity to exert a similar influence on the other side, though we are probably not wrong in surmising that there is a certain amount of opposition among the masses in the East. There are always upright and truth-loving people to whom lying and tyranny are hateful, but one cannot judge whether they exert any decisive influences on the mass under a police regime. That's so far out, huh? It really, in a sense, feels like that's what we've come to now. We've come to, if we look at what we saw in the communist state in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and how appalled we were by the dominance of the state. And now here we are, communism in most part, except in China, has died. And yet now we have kind of a almost a communistic kind of approach to the state, where the state has become, Canada, the United States has become and that's really interesting to witness.
The statistical averaging of the humans and the materialistic viewpoint, right? A good
Exactly.
a good resource is, if you've never read it, is a guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he spent 9 years in a gulag in Russia, and he wrote a book, Gulag Archipelago. But when he was released, he did a tour of all the Western countries, and his book is called A Warning to the West, and it's a compilation of all his speeches, and it's very, very poignant. It basically talks about everything that we're talking about now.
Far out, far out.
It's a small book too, so if anyone wants an extra resource. Okay, here we go. In view of this uncomfortable situation, the question is heard again and again in the West. What can we do to counter this threat from the East? Even though the West has considerable industrial power and a sizable defense potential at its command, we cannot rest content with this, for we know that even the biggest armaments and the heaviest industry, coupled with a relatively high living standard, are not enough to check the psychic infection spread by religious fanaticism.
Hmm. He kind of foretells the armament race, that we saw in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Jung kind of predicts that.
But what we need is a psychic armament, or a spiritual armament, right? Is more what we needed rather than a physical one. But
Right.
he continues on, I think, later.
Yeah, at the end of the chapter. So here we go again. The West has unfortunately not yet woken up to the fact that our appeal to idealism and reason and other desirable virtues, delivered with so much enthusiasm, is mere bombination in the void. It is a puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith, however twisted this faith may appear to us. We are faced not with a situation that can be overcome by rational or moral arguments, but an unleashing of emotional forces and ideas engendered by the spirit of the times. And these, as we know from experience, are not much influenced by rational reflections and still less by moral exhortation. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmic, the antidote, should in this case be an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. That's really important. I'll repeat that sentence. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmic, the antidote, should in this case be an equally potent faith of the different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. Unhappily, the little word should, which never fails to appear in this connection, points to a certain weakness, if not the absence of this desideratum, So he's saying that really we don't have, the way to counteract the faith in the state, because we have made the state into a religion, and so the only way that we can counteract this faith in the state, which creates a psychic epidemic, is to actually have a devotion to a religious system that's just as great. But unfortunately, we don't have that. Not only does the West lack a uniform faith that could block the progress of a fanatical ideology, but as the father of Marxist philosophy, it makes use of exactly the same intellectual assumptions, the same arguments and aims. Although the churches in the West enjoy full freedom, they are not less full or empty than in the East. Yet they exercise no noticeable influence on the broad course of politics. The disadvantage of a creed as a public institution is that it serves two masters. On the one hand, it derives its existence from the relationship of man to God, and on the other, it owes a duty to the state, namely to the world, in which connection it can appeal to the saying, render unto Caesar, and various other admonitions in the New Testament. And a lot of times you need to translate almost what Jung says. And so what he's saying, to a contemporary language, what he's saying is that, the creed, the religious, systems, the dogmas, the creed have two functions. They give you a relationship with God, but they also align with the state, which nowadays that really has evaporated, except in some circles. But now our connection to the creed, we develop, the state has become so good at making itself the dominant spiritual principle, the dominant, it's like, we're almost follow, our nationalistic views have taken place of our religious views. And so then the creed is in a place where it actually serves the nationalistic, and so because of that, then it becomes inefficient at being a antidote to psychic infection.
Yeah. Well, and freedom, as Michael Tessarian always says, is attitudinal, and what happens with the state, rather than this creed creating freedom for the individual, it's actually enslaved them further.
Right.
There's a good book by Erich Fromm, the psychologist, called Escape from Freedom, and it talks about Luther and Calvin and Protestantism and stuff, and it's basically how people want freedom from freedom. They don't actually want real freedom. They want to be free from the burden of freedom, individualism and stuff like that. That's kind of why they worship the state so much, because it takes the burden of responsibility off them, and you can't separate freedom from responsibility, right?
Yes. No, we worship freedom, but we actually don't have any of it.
Freedom from freedom. It's so good, man.
That's cool. Okay, you want to get the next one?
Yeah, sure. In early times, and until comparatively recent, there was, therefore, talk of power ordained by God. Today, this conception is antiquated. The church stands for traditional and collective convictions, which, in the case of many of their adherents, are no longer based on their own inner experience, but on unreflecting belief, which is notoriously apt to disappear as soon as one begins thinking about it. The content of belief then comes into collision with knowledge, and it often turns out that the irrationality of the former is no match for the ratiocinations of the latter. Belief is no adequate substitute for inner experience, and where this is absent, even a strong faith, which came miraculously as a gift of grace, may depart equally miraculously. People call faith the true religious experience, but they do not stop to consider that actually it is a secondary phenomenon arising from the fact that something happens to us in the first place, with instilled, this is Greek, I can't read it, into us, that is, trust and loyalty. This experience has a definite content that can be interpreted in terms of one or other of the denominational creeds. But the more this is so, the more the possibilities of these conflicts with knowledge mount up, which in themselves are quite pointless. That is to say, the standpoint of the creed is archaic. They are full of impressive mythological symbols which, if taken literally, come into insufferable conflict with knowledge. But if, for instance, the statement that Christ rose from the dead is to be understood not literally, but symbolically, then it is capable of various interpretations that do not conflict with knowledge and do not impair the meaning of the statement. The objection that understanding it symbolically puts an end to the Christian hope of immortality is invalid, because long before the coming of Christianity, mankind believed in a life after death, and therefore had no need of the Easter event as a guarantee of immortality. The danger that mythology, understood too literally, and as taught by the Church, will suddenly be repudiated lock, stock, and barrel, is today greater than ever. It is not time that the Christian mythology, instead of being wiped out, was understood. Is it not time that the Christian mythology, instead of being wiped out, was understood symbolically for once?
Yeah, that beautiful word, huh? Ratiocinations to rational, to think, to the, yeah.
Well, what he touches on here is like the belief is not knowing. It's not inner knowing from inner experience, right? It's I believe something. It's
and
not
and
belief and knowing are completely different.
and rationalization of things that we can't understand rationally, that we can only understand symbolically. We can't, Christianity is a symbolic system, and if you want to try to understand it rationalistically, then it doesn't make any sense. But if you understand it symbolically, then it makes sense. It is, back to the text, it is still too early to say what might be the consequences of a general recognition of the fatal parallelism between the state religion of the Marxist and the state religion of the church. Whoa, I'll repeat that again. It is still too early to say what might be the consequences of a general recognition of the fatal parallelism between the state religion of the Marxist and the state religion of the church. It's actually the same thing. The absolute claim of civitas Dei that is represented by man bears an unfortunate resemblance to the divinity of the state. And the moral conclusion drawn by Ignatius Loyola from the authority of the church, under quotation mark, in parenthesis, the end sanctifies the mean, anticipates the lie as a political instrument in an exceedingly dangerous way. Wow, that's big. That the end justifies the means is something we hear all the time. And that usually lying also is part of that justification of the mean. And so right off the bat, the same deception that we find in Marxism and in communism is also present in the state religion. Both demand unqualified submission to fate and thus curtail man's freedom. The one is freedom before God, and the other is freedom before the state, thereby digging the grave for the individual. The fragile existence of this, so far as we know, unique carrier of life is threatened on both sides, despite their respective promises of spiritual and material ideals to come, and how many of us can, in the long run, fight against the proverbial wisdom of a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Besides which, the West cherishes the same scientific and rationalistic Weltanschauung with its statistical leveling down tendency and materialistic aims as the state religion of the Eastern Bloc, as I have explained before. So basically saying that our religious and our nationalistic fervor of the state religion, all of that is the same as Marxism, and that this word Weltanschauung is the belief. It's the way of belief of our times. So our rationalistic Weltanschauung, with its statistical leveling down tendency and materialistic aims, as the state religion of the Eastern Bloc aims, it's the same as the aims of the state religion of the Eastern Bloc, I've explained before. So it's really what he's saying is really relevant, but it's really a very poignant historical and political commentary on the times that he lived through, but it's also very much applicable to what we're living through collectively right now.
Yeah, well, Cicero said, if you don't know history, you're like a child. You don't know your history. But Weltanschauung actually translates as philosophy of life.
Right.
Like, and so Ayn Rand, I find so many comparisons between Jung and Ayn Rand, and her philosophy was called objectivism. But what she talks about is like whatever your philosophy is what you will get. It's like an equation. Like if your philosophy is something that doesn't respect individualism and freedom, it equals what you will get out of it, right? And so this, and Jung uses Weltanschauung quite a bit in other works as well. And it's depends on what your philosophy of life is what you're going to get out of life, really.
Exactly.
So here, this is a long one. What then has the West, with its political and denominational schisms, to offer to modern man in his need? Nothing, unfortunately, except a variety of paths all leading to one goal, which is practically indistinguishable from the Marxist ideal. It requires no special effort of understanding to see where the communist ideology gets the certainty of its belief that time is on its side, and that the world is ripe for conversion. The facts speak a language that is all too plain in this respect. It will not help us in the West to shut our eyes to this and not recognize our fatal vulnerability. Anyone who has once learned to submit absolutely to a collective belief and to renounce his eternal right to freedom and the equally eternal duty of individual responsibility will persist in this attitude and will be able to march with the same credulity and the same lack of criticism in the reverse direction, if another and manifestly better belief is foisted upon his alleged idealism. Wow, that's exactly what I was saying before. Right?
Yeah.
Freedom and responsibility. What happened not so long ago to a civilized European nation? We accused the Germans of having forgotten it all again already, but the truth is that we don't know for certain whether something similar might not happen elsewhere. It would not be surprising if it did. And if another civilized nation succumbed to the infection of a uniform and one-sided idea, we permit ourselves the question, which countries have the biggest communist parties? America, which oque mutio rerum forms the real political backbone of Western Europe, seems to be immune because of the outspoken counterposition she has adopted. But in point of fact, she is perhaps even more vulnerable than Europe, since her educational system is the most influenced by the scientific Weltanschauung, which its statistical truths, and her mixed population finds it difficult to strike roots in a soil that is practically without history. The historical and humanistic type of education, so sorely needed in such circumstance, leads, on the contrary, a Cinderella existence. Though Europe possesses this latter requirement, she uses it to her own undoing in the form of nationalistic egoism and paralyzing skepticism. Common to both is the materialistic and collectivist goal, and both lack the very thing that expresses and grips the whole man, namely an idea which puts the individual human being in the center as a measure of all things.
That's what makes Jung so difficult to read and yet so powerful, huh? You kind of have to read it over and over again to understand what he's saying. But his understanding of the historical, plight of modern man is so profound. We could take this paragraph and this whole essay and just continue to get so much out of it.
Well, I must have read this 5 or 6 times, and you still get more out of it every time.
Yeah, no, I think I've reading it probably a dozen times, and then this time, as we're doing it, I'm even getting more out of it, really.
We don't want to stop to digress too much, but like every 2 or 3 sentences, you could stop and talk for 10 or 15 minutes, right? So
exactly. Okay, last paragraph. And I think that this is where he really lowers the hammer. Although this last paragraph is really potent. This idea alone is enough to arouse the most violent doubts and resistance on all sides. And one could almost go so far as to assert that the valuelessness of the individual in comparison with large numbers is the one belief that meets with universal and unanimous assent. We value the mass more than the individual. To be sure, we all say that this is the century of the common man, that he is the Lord of the earth, the air, and the water, and that on his decision hangs the historical fate of the nations. This proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion, and is counterbalanced by a reality that is very different. In this reality, man is the slave and victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. I'll repeat that. In this reality, man is the slave and victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. He is intimidated and endangered by the might of the military technology, which is supposed to safeguard his physical existence. His spiritual and moral freedom, though guaranteed within limits in one half of his world, is threatened with chaotic disorientation, and in the other half is abolished altogether. Finally, to add comedy to tragedy, this lord of the elements, this universal arbiter, hugs to his bosom notions which stamp his dignity as worthless and turn his autonomy into an absurdity. All his achievements and possessions do not make him bigger. On the contrary, they diminish him. As the fate of the factory worker under the rule of a just distribution of goods clearly demonstrates. He pays for his share of the factory with the loss of personal property. He exchanges his freedom of movement for the doubtful pleasure of being tied to his place of employment. He forfeits all means of improving his position if he jibs against being ground down by exhausting piecework. And if he shows any signs of intelligence, political precepts are thrust down his throat with a bit of technical knowledge thrown in. If he is lucky, if he is lucky. However, a roof over one's head and a daily feed for the useful animal are not to be sneezed at when the bare necessities of life may be cut off from one day to the next. You can reread that paragraph 4 times and get more and more out of it. But this proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion and is counterbalanced by a reality that is very different. In this reality, man is the slave and victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. He is intimidated and endangered by the might of military technology, which is supposed to safeguard his physical existence. And now we can, this great shift that's going on, in our times, from the military industrial complex to the pharmaceutical industrial complex. We used to talk about the military industrial complex being so interested in propagating wars. And now we have the pharmaceutical industrial complex that has really captured our healing systems and our government, so that really we find ourselves with the illusion of freedom, but really we have become slaves to the technological advances that we've made. How profound. And that this was written in 1957. It's like, wow. How do you feel about that?
A friend of mine told me with every technological advance, there's a natural loss, right? And it kind of reminds me of like when church bells first started ringing every hour, and it's like to remind you of like, it's like Chronos versus Kairos, right? There's that natural time, and then there's this mechanical time, right? And it's kind of like with like for the internet, I love the internet because I can use it as a tool, but people become enslaved to it. And it's like that with every other thing. And with these technological advances, how people are less evolved now than ever, I feel, because they've just become slaves, like you said, to these tools rather than using the tool as a tool and not letting the tool basically use you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this has been a very enlightened chapter. Thanks, Luke, for joining me for this. And thank you, the watcher. I think please pass this on. And there's still 4 more chapters to read. And some of those chapters are long, so we'll break them up in half. Please subscribe to our channels and comment, ask questions. Those comments are so important, and it's also how the algorithms work, right? If you like something, if you share it, if you're commenting on it, then it tells that this material is valuable to you and they should promote it to others. So we, in a sense, are slaves to the technology, but we can also learn to work the technology to be in service to our process of individuation and what we have to contribute.
And if there are questions, it'd be nice to open up a bit of a dialogue too with people, and maybe we can do a separate video later that answers those questions as well.
Well, it is unlimited really, and we could go live at a particular point, but let's just stick with what we got, just to be able to stick with every Saturday, come up with a new one and pass it on to your friends, and subscribe to our channels. And this is MC Starman and Luke Renda. Thanks,
Peace.
Luke.
The next chapter will be more exciting, I feel like. That's a good one.
Chapter 4 is the individual's understanding of himself.
I think that's like the center point of this whole essay.
Well, the next 4 chapters are really, really cool. Not that the first 3 were not.
He had to lay the historical groundwork and stuff too, right? And so that's important if people who don't have any historical footing to stand on, it's a little more confusing. Eric Fromm's book Escape from Freedom is good, as well as Solzhenitsyn's Warning to the West. And a lot of people, it's a little unnerving when you get into a lot of this history stuff, but eventually he's setting it up for the later chapters, so I feel like it was needed.
Well, one of Jung's chief complaint to the modern man was that postmodern man is unhistorical. It doesn't really, and reading Jung is what you gain from reading Jung personally, is you get a perspective of the history of the evolution of the human soul, because his work is, if anything, Jung, although he left us 18 volumes of his collected works, and so much more besides that, and so we can look at him as a writer, but most importantly, Jung was a student, and his ability to study was unparalleled, and his ability to process. And he wasn't a philosopher, and he wasn't an historian. He was a doctor, and and he looked at psychology as the science of the soul, and he looked at himself as a healer of the soul. And so here, that this is a doctor speaking, and so it adds a lot of depth to his philosophies. And thank you, Luke, for being able to give us so many other references to other thinkers and teachers. And this has been fun, and we'll keep it going.
Okay, hope you enjoyed it.
And see you next week.
See ya.
Woohoo!